March 4th, 1946. Northern Honshu. Snow still clung to the rooftops in thin gray sheets. Wind curled through the broken windows of what had once been a schoolhouse, now stripped of desks, books, and warmth. In the alley behind it, 11-year-old Emi Takahashi leaned into her mother's side and whispered, "Do you smell that?" Her mother, Keiko, didn't answer. She was trying to keep the baby from crying, rocking him gently under her coat. But she smelled it too. Something hot, something foreign, something impossible. It wasn't rice, not miso or fish or pickled plum. It was oily, smoky, sharp with meat and fat. It was beef cooked seared. It was a smell that hadn't existed in Japan for years. Not in the bombed-out cities. Not in the mountains where winter was still clawing at the land. Not where Keiko had last begged for sweet potatoes at a train station and been beaten for it. And yet here it was, drifting over the ridge, curling through the alleys. The smell of burgers. Emi's eyes widened. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't old enough to know what a burger was, but her body knew. It was food and it was close. She took her brother's hand. "Let's follow it." They weren't the only ones. By the time Keiko reached the top of the hill, dozens of others had appeared, gaunt mothers holding babies, hollow-cheeked children, old men in threadbare kimonos with their hands tucked under their sleeves. No one spoke. No one had to. The smell was doing the talking. The ridge overlooked what had once been a military depot. It had been shelled into oblivion in the last months of the war. Now, in its place, stood something they couldn't quite understand. A line of olive-green tents, American trucks, soldiers, big, pale-skinned men in canvas jackets and helmets, moving with purpose. And in the center, a steel chimney puffing out smoke. Beneath it, a flat-top grill glistened with oil and heat. A field kitchen. There was no ceremony. No guards posted at the perimeter. No rifles aimed outward. Just Americans working over sizzling meat, flipping patties with practiced rhythm, stacking them onto trays with buns, onions, pickles, mustard. The smell was overwhelming. Keiko held her children back, her instincts warning her not to get too close. The war was over, but these were still the enemy. The same men who had dropped firebombs on Tokyo. The same army that had reduced entire districts of Osaka and Nagoya to ashes. And yet there were no barbed wire fences here, no shouting, no boots pounding the ground, just soldiers cooking. And then one of them turned. He looked up from the grill, noticed the crowd at the ridge. He said something to another man. They looked, nodded. And then he waved. It was not a warning, it was an invitation. The first to move was a boy, no older than 12. His ribs showed through his jacket. He took one step down the slope, then another. When no one stopped him, he started walking faster. Another followed, then a third. Soon a slow trickle of bodies moved down the hill. Not a charge, not a mob, just quiet desperation, too tired to be afraid anymore. Keiko hesitated. Emi tugged at her hand. "Mama, please." The baby whimpered. She looked down at her children, then at the smoke, and then finally she stepped forward. The Americans didn't speak Japanese. The villagers didn't speak English, but none of it mattered. A soldier with freckles handed a burger to the first boy in line. The boy stared at it for a moment, as if unsure whether to bow, to salute, or to cry. Then he bit into it. Juice rolled down his chin. He didn't stop to breathe. An older woman shuffled up next. She bowed deeply. A soldier, confused, bowed back. They both smiled awkwardly. She was handed 2 burgers. She took one and passed it immediately to the child beside her. The soldiers worked fast. The grill was hot, the patties coming off in waves. They opened crates, pulled out cans of milk, handed them to children who stared like it was gold. One soldier knelt down and offered a metal cup to a little girl. She took it, then hesitated until he sipped from the same cup first and smiled. Only then did she drink. Keiko held her breath as she reached the front. The soldier behind the table looked young, maybe 20. His name tag read Carver. He looked tired. He looked at her, then at Emmy, then the baby. 3 burgers, no hesitation. One went into her hand. The second he knelt to give to Emmy. The third he broke in half and slipped to the baby with a glance that asked permission. Keiko nodded once. The smell was no longer just a smell. It was heat. It was nourishment. It was survival. Keiko didn't cry until she tasted it. The flavor was greasy, rich, entirely foreign, and it broke something loose inside her. Not just hunger, not just memory, but the realization that for the first time in years, someone had given her children food without asking for anything back. No papers, no bows, no shame. Only the sound of meat sizzling on steel, the clink of metal trays, and the gentle laughter of men who had, months earlier, been her enemies. As the day wore on, the crowd grew. Word spread like wildfire. Families appeared from neighboring villages, then from farther out, barefoot, rag-wrapped, hungry. The Americans didn't send them away. They opened more crates, buns, milk powder, canned vegetables, even chocolate. The field kitchen, meant to serve 800 men, fed over 1,400 civilians that day. When the rations ran low, the soldiers didn't hoard what was left. They gave away their own. Some even left the line to sit with the children, breaking burgers in half to stretch the last trays. No one took more than they needed. No one pushed. No one had to. Because something had changed on that hill. Something the Emperor's broadcasts had never explained. Something no propaganda poster could have predicted. These Americans were not devils. They were cooks. Feeding children. By the third morning, the path up the hill was worn flat. Muddy footprints layered over each other, and the snow at the edges had melted from so many bodies passing through. Children came first, running ahead with empty cups and wide eyes. Then the older ones, brothers, mothers, grandfathers carrying canvas sacks, old sake bottles rinsed out for milk, anything that could hold something warm. Keiko arrived early that day. She de-left before sunrise with Emmy and the baby bundled together beneath her coat. She no longer questioned the decision. She had stopped worrying about how it looked to accept food from the Americans. The war was over. The shame would come later. Right now, her children needed to eat. There was already a line when she arrived. Maybe 60 people, some from her own village, some from a fishing town she'd only heard about in passing, a few in tattered naval uniforms, quietly ignoring each other. The soldiers were already setting up. No flags, no orders barked, just the hiss of steam, the clatter of pans, and the low murmur of English voices, strange, musical, half understood. She caught words like griddle and milk run and back in Iowa, but they meant nothing to her. The smell meant everything. This time, it wasn't just burgers. There were eggs, powdered probably, but still scrambled and hot. And real bread, not rice bread or barley scraps, wheat bread, white and soft, steaming where it had been cut. She could hear stomachs growling all around her. Behind her, someone coughed violently. She turned to see a man, mid-40s, maybe dressed in a tattered suit coat that had once been formal but was now soaked and fraying. He had 2 children with him, maybe 7 and 5. The little one looked barely able to stand. Keiko whispered to Emmy. Without needing a reply, her daughter nodded, and they stepped aside to let the trio move ahead in line. The man bowed deeply. He didn't say thank you. He couldn't, not out loud. But his eyes did. Later that morning, the line began to move. One of the American soldiers, tall, dark-skinned, with a wide jaw and eyes that scanned the crowd gently, looked toward the back of the line and pointed. A boy, barefoot and shivering, stood near the trees, watching, not approaching, just watching. The soldier walked over, kneeling low. He took off his glove and offered a small bun with half a patty between it. No words, just an outstretched hand. The boy hesitated, then took it. A second later, 3 more children emerged from behind the tree, siblings probably. The soldier chuckled, turned back, raised 4 fingers in the air. Another man brought over a tray. Within minutes, the tree line had vanished. Dozens more emerged, too ashamed to come forward at first, now drawn by example. The Americans didn't flinch, they just worked faster. By noon, there were over 200 people on the hill. No one pushed, no one shouted. Even the children, once fed, turned back to help others. Emmy handed out slices of bread to a younger girl who'd been too scared to move. And somewhere in the middle of the crowd, the man with the tattered coat knelt beside a soldier who was trying badly to draw Japanese characters in the dirt. The man corrected him with a twig, drawing slowly. Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Children. The soldier nodded, then wrote something beside it in blocky English. Burgers. They both laughed. The sound cut through the wind like spring thaw. A small wooden sign appeared by the grill the next day. It wasn't official, just cardboard nailed to a stick. On it, scrawled in pencil and uneven letters, it read, "Kids first." It didn't need translation. The mothers understood. The grandfathers nodded. The older boys stood back and let the smaller ones go ahead. Order emerged, not enforced, not dictated, chosen. And the Americans kept cooking. On the 4th day, a new truck arrived, not with troops, with supplies. Flour, butter, canned peaches. The field kitchen expanded. Tables were set up. One soldier from Alabama, judging by the accent, took it upon himself to teach a group of teenagers how to flip pancakes. They didn't speak a word of English, but he mimed everything with exaggerated movements. The griddle hissed, batter spilled, and everyone laughed when one flipped pancake landed on a boot. That day, for the first time, there was music. Someone brought out a crank radio, tuned it to a crackling signal. Big band, brass, something American, loud and strange and almost holy. It drifted over the crowd like incense. For a moment, the children didn't just eat, they danced. Tiny, awkward steps, just bouncing on tired legs, arms flailing with joy. The war didn't end with parades in these villages, but in that moment, it ended in laughter. By the end of the week, the field kitchen had a name. Not official, not painted, but spoken, passed from one child to another like legend. The Burger Hill. It was not a place on any map, not a line in any treaty, not a headline in any newspaper. But to the families who walked for miles just to stand in that line, it was a sanctuary. Not because it was American, not because it was free, but because it was human. Keiko sat with her children beneath the pine tree near the edge of the field. The baby slept with a smear of bread stuck to his cheek. Emmy was giggling with a group of boys who were miming how to toss a pancake high enough to reach the sun. She looked around. At the soldiers. At the smoke. At the stacks of bread and the hot food being handed out. At the way people no longer approached cautiously, but walked upright. And she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Not hope, that was too fragile. It was trust. Just a little, but real. The kind that comes when the hunger in your stomach is gone, and the hunger in your heart finally quiets. Within 2 weeks, the ridge trail became a road. Not paved, not official, but worn down by hundreds of feet each day, bare soles, sandals cut from tires, geta dragging through slush and thaw. Families came from farther out now. Villages 3, 5, even 10 kilometers away sent their hungry, their sick, their hopeful. The Burger Hill was no longer just a field kitchen. It was an event. The Americans didn't know what to call it. They just kept showing up, lighting the griddle, unpacking more crates. Someone brought folding tables. Another drove in a field stove from a nearby depot, doubling the hot plate space. When the locals started bringing empty bottles and pails, one of the engineers rigged a spigot to dispense warm broth from a converted fuel drum. It wasn't organized, but it worked. Every morning the same quiet crowd lined up. Children first, then mothers. The old, the limping. The men came last, the wounded, the ashamed, the ones who still didn't know whether they were allowed to be forgiven. No one was turned away. By now, Keiko had become a kind of unofficial helper, not by being told, not by being asked, but because someone had to. She helped organize the line, kept the children from wandering too close to the hot plates, taught the other women how to reuse old fabric to carry home warm buns without burning their hands. One morning, she saw Emmy show a little boy how to sip milk slowly so it didn't make him throw up. The boy hadn't spoken, but when Emmy handed him half a bun, he took it and broke it in two again, passing half to his sister without looking at her. Keiko watched them and felt a pressure behind her eyes that she forced back down. They had nothing, and yet they shared. That too was survival. Word spread far beyond the village, not through papers or broadcasts. Those still carried warnings about looters, traitors, and occupation directives, but word of mouth carried faster than any radio. By the end of March, the soldiers on Burger Hill were feeding over 2,000 civilians a day. The kitchen wasn't meant for that. It was designed to serve a single battalion. But when the depot truck driver from the 8th Logistics Company arrived and saw the line wrapping down the hill and into the valley beyond, he didn't say a word. He opened the back doors and started unloading. More flour, more canned meat, more powdered milk. He handed the clipboard to the sergeant in charge and muttered, "Gonna need 4 more of these next week." Then he lit a cigarette and watched a barefoot girl skip past with half a burger in her hand. That same day, the commanding officer of the field kitchen, a lieutenant named Ramos from New Mexico, barely 25 years old, was visited by a pair of officers from the regional headquarters. They asked the questions politely at first. Who authorized this? What supply line are you pulling from? Do you have security for crowd control? Ramos didn't flinch. He led them past the trays, past the children, past the families waiting in line. He didn't raise his voice. He just pointed at a girl with no shoes eating a burger on a tin plate, one sock pulled over her left hand for warmth. Tell her to go home hungry. The officers said nothing. They didn't come back. The unofficial policy became clearer. Don't ask, don't stop. Some soldiers grumbled, not out of cruelty, just weariness. We're running a damn soup kitchen for the whole prefecture, one muttered as he fried his 20th batch of patties that morning. But another man beside him, an older corporal from Tennessee, shrugged. Beats shooting, he said, flipping another burger. In the weeks that followed, things changed again. The children started bringing gifts. Not real ones, they had nothing of value, but tokens, bamboo carvings, flowers twisted into cord. One boy brought a jar with a single dead firefly inside, thinking maybe the Americans could light it again. They accepted each one like treasure. Then the parents began bringing things too. At first, just quiet bows, deeper each day, then small paper fans, sacks of dried radish, a cracked ceramic cup with a crane painted in fading blue. One woman brought a bundle of dried tea leaves wrapped in cloth. She had carried it from a shrine nearly 10 miles away. The Americans never asked for anything, but they began building a shelf, an old ammo crate nailed to a plank, where they placed every gift they were given. It became its own kind of altar. One rainy afternoon, a soldier named O'Malley stood in front of it and read the characters on a paper charm tied to a bamboo flute. What's this mean? Keiko was nearby drying plates. She paused, then said, "Peace." He stared at it for a long time, then nodded. The shelf stayed up even after the rain washed everything else off the hill. There were rumors, too, at first whispered, then louder. that the Americans were trying to convert the children, that the burgers were laced with something to make people obedient, that Burger Hill was a trap, a census-taking station in disguise, collecting faces and names for a future roundup. But no one who had been there believed it. No one who had eaten at that table, felt the heat of that griddle, watched their child be handed a warm bun by a man who didn't even speak their language. None of them believed it. You couldn't fake that kind of mercy. And so the crowds kept growing. One morning in early April, Keiko awoke to find a note pinned to her door. It was from a neighbor, scrawled in charcoal. "Two families from Tono passed through last night. Said Burger Hill saved them. They walked 20 miles. That day, the line was the longest it had ever been." Keiko arrived early. Emmy helped distribute bowls. The baby, not quite a baby anymore, walked for the first time between the crates while a soldier cheered softly and handed him a pickle like it was a medal. At the end of the day, when the last plate had been cleaned, Lieutenant Ramos sat down on a crate, peeled off his gloves, and looked out over the hill. "You think they'll remember this?" he asked no one in particular. A nearby corporal, older than most, rubbed his knee and said, "Not our names, but maybe the way it smelled." "The burgers." "No," the corporal said, "the part where the wind didn't smell like smoke anymore." That night, for the first time in years, the villagers lit paper lanterns and set them floating down the stream. Not for mourning. For thanks. The river carried them away, glowing softly like distant stars. They floated past the hill, past the trucks, past the soldiers cleaning up in the dark. And none of it, not the burgers, not the field stove, not the crates of powdered milk, had been planned. It just happened. And it kept happening. Because on that hill for those weeks, hunger was answered. Not with policy, not with propaganda. With meat, with bread, with kindness. With the sound of children laughing into the wind. The rain returned in late April, heavier than usual, drenching the trail to Burger Hill until it turned to slop. Still, they came. By then, everyone in the valley knew someone who had eaten there. The stories changed depending on who told them. Some said the soldiers were sent from America specifically to feed orphans. Others claimed they were punishment units, trying to earn redemption through kindness. A few whispered they were angels or ghosts, dispatched by the gods in response to a prayer the emperor never said aloud. But none of the stories explained why the food kept coming. Trucks still rolled up the ridge every third morning. Crates were unloaded, griddles lit. Fires kept dry with stretched tarps strung between pine trees. There were days when the wind froze water in the cups before the children could drink, and still the line held. Still the burgers sizzled. The soldiers called it the mission that never ended. They didn't salute anymore, didn't post watches. There was no enemy left on that hill, just hunger. Even so, not everyone in the village supported it. One afternoon, Keiko returned home to find her neighbor waiting by the door, Mrs. Nakamura, widow of a captain in the Imperial Navy, her voice sharp and brittle like frostbitten leaves. "You shouldn't take the children there anymore," she said without preamble. Keiko blinked. "Why?" "It's unseemly. They're still the occupiers. They're feeding us. They're training our children to be beggars, don't you see?" Keiko didn't reply right away. She looked down at her hands, chapped and red from scrubbing the field kitchen's trays. Then she said, "My children slept with full stomachs for the first time in a year. If that makes them beggars, then I'll kneel beside them." Mrs. Nakamura said nothing. She turned and walked away. Keiko never saw her on the hill. But her granddaughter showed up 2 mornings later, silent and alone, standing in the rain with no umbrella and shoes wrapped in cloth. She left with a bowl of soup and half a burger wrapped carefully in newspaper. No one mentioned it. One morning the trucks didn't come. The trail remained empty. No engine rumble, no voices, the hill was still. At first no one panicked. Perhaps a flat tire. Perhaps the road was washed out. But by mid-morning the line of villagers had grown long and the griddle sat cold. Keiko found Lieutenant Ramos crouched by the supply tent, writing something on a clipboard with a pencil that kept breaking. "They've pulled us from the depot rotation," he said without looking up. "Some general's office wants to centralize rations." "What does that mean?" "It means no more crates." She stood in silence. Around her, the wind carried not the scent of burgers, but the sour, metallic smell of wet canvas and ash. "They say we should consolidate," Ramos added. "Send people to designated feeding stations, central kitchens in the cities." "But that's 50 kilometers. Most can't even walk 5. "I know." He set the pencil down, rubbed his face. He looked older than last week. "I'll try to requisition through another channel," he said. "No promises." Keiko nodded. She didn't cry, but when she looked back down the hill and saw the children playing in the dirt, oblivious, she wished she could be that young again, young enough to not understand how quickly good things disappeared. The next morning, Ramos returned with a single box. It wasn't from the depot. It had no stamps or labels. Just an old shipping crate cornered in rust. Inside, flour, 2 cans of oil, and 1 tin of cocoa powder. The men stared at it in silence. It wasn't enough for even 1 hour of service. And then, one by one, they began emptying their own rations. Private Ortiz gave up his week's sugar. Jenkins gave his meat can. O'Malley handed over his last pack of cigarettes to trade for sweetened condensed milk. By noon, they had a small pile of ingredients, barely enough for 100 servings. Keiko helped measure, Emmy helped wrap. They cooked what they could. They gave it all to the children. That afternoon, Ramos sent a private to the city on foot, with a handwritten message requesting emergency field supplies from a relief team in Sendai. He wasn't sure if it would work. He sent it anyway. That night the sky cleared. Lanterns flickered along the trail again. The soldiers passed around a bottle of sake someone had left as thanks. No one said it out loud, but they all knew the kitchen would be gone soon. Not because anyone wanted it to end. Because it wasn't meant to last. 2 days later, 3 American trucks appeared on the horizon. They weren't from the depot. The lead driver was a civilian contractor. Behind him, crates stacked high, marked with the red crescent of the International Relief Fund. Flour, beans, canned peaches, a full barrel of salt, tin cups, spoons, a sack of onions. And meat. Not rationed, donated. The hill burst into motion. The griddle sizzled before sunrise the next day. Ramos never found out who approved the delivery. Some officer, some administrator, someone with a stamp and a conscience. But when the second delivery came a week later, unrequested, but clearly labeled Field Kitchen, East Ridge Station, he understood. Someone somewhere had seen the numbers, or heard the stories, or both. Burger Hill had become more than an accident. It was being preserved. A senior officer arrived that weekend to inspect the site. His boots were new, his jacket pressed. He stepped carefully over the mud and looked around without speaking. He watched the children laugh, watched the buns pass hand to hand, watched a 10-year-old bow deeply to a soldier holding out a warm cup of soup. Then he walked back to his jeep and left without saying a word. The kitchen stayed open. And that, more than anything, meant it had been approved. By mid-May, the Americans built a small awning out of salvaged wood and corrugated tin. They posted no signs, but the locals began calling it the shelter. It wasn't for sleeping. It was a place to sit and eat with dignity. That was the real difference. No more kneeling in the mud, no more wiping rain from bread. Now there was a roof, a table, places for the elders to rest, mats for the children. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't even finished, but it was shelter. And sometimes that's all people need. One day, a mother placed a small wrapped package on the table before she left. When Keiko opened it, she found two hand-stitched cloth dolls, one with black thread for hair, the other with golden. Tucked between them, a note written in kanji. Our children eat side by side. Let them never point guns at each other again. Ramos read it once, then asked Keiko to translate it aloud in front of the men. No one spoke for a long time afterward. They just kept cooking. The rain finally ended in early June. By then, Burger Hill was no longer called that by the Americans. They referred to it by its quartermaster code, Post-Emergency Humanitarian Supplement Point, Northern Honshu Sector. But none of them used that name out loud. Not in letters home, not in reports. Among themselves, it remained what the locals had called it from the beginning. The Hill. The food kept coming, not just from the military supply line but from home. Boxes began arriving marked from Chicago, Denver, Sacramento. Carefully wrapped parcels full of hard candy, letters from schoolchildren, stacks of wool socks and mittens knit by women in church basements. Some came with drawings, stick figures of smiling soldiers handing hamburgers to grinning kids under a bright sunner, seated on crates. No one translated, no one needed to. Friend was a word that needed no nation. By summer, Keiko had returned to something she hadn't thought possible, routine, not stability, not yet, but rhythm. Her days were marked by the walk up the hill, the warmth of the shelter, the creak of the tray table, the smell of broth and beef and toasted bread. And the laughter, always the laughter. One evening, after the last meal had been served, Lieutenant Ramos pulled a clipboard from his bag and called Keiko over. "I've been asked to keep some notes," he said, awkwardly tapping the pencil, "about this, for the report." "What kind of notes?" "Who came, how many, if it helped. You know, the kind of things that get counted." Keiko looked at the papers. There were rows of tallies, columns of food types, supply logs. Underneath one page, in smaller handwriting, was a sentence scrawled in a different style. "They came hungry and left laughing." She pointed at it. "That's all they need to know." Ramos smiled, folded the paper, didn't write anything else. The kitchen finally closed on August 14th. No one said it was ending, but the crowd knew. The line felt different that day, slower, heavier. The children were quiet. The mothers clutched bowls more tightly. When the griddle was turned off, no one clapped. There was no ceremony, just a shared silence. Then the gifts started coming. One by one, families stepped forward and left something behind. A scarf, a carved flute, a letter in calligraphy, a bag of dried persimmons, a broken comb from a grandmother's wedding dowry, a toy carved from driftwood. They left them not as bribes, not as tribute, but as memory. The shelf of tokens, once a small ledge nailed to a board, overflowed. Soldiers began placing the gifts in boxes, carefully wrapping each one in wax paper, storing them in crates they labeled "Keep, Do Not Discard." Ramos took a final head count. 4,000 civilians served over 90 days, 24 soldiers, 6 griddles, countless smiles. He didn't include that part in the report. The next morning, the tents were taken down. The field stove was loaded onto a flatbed, the griddle scrubbed clean. By noon, the hill was quiet again. But not empty. The shelf remained. Keiko stood beside it as the last truck rolled away. She touched the edge of the wood and whispered something Emmy couldn't hear. The girl asked, "Will they come back?" Keiko didn't answer. Instead, she knelt, picked up a small flag made of stitched cloth from the ground, and tucked it into her coat. "Maybe," she said, "but if not, we'll remember." A week later, a school opened in the village. One of the first lessons the children wrote on the board was a word none of them had been taught in kanji. A borrowed word, phonetic and strange, scribbled in rough katakana by a boy who had never seen it printed before. Japanese letter, Japanese letter, Japanese letter, Japanese letter. Burger. The teacher said nothing, just let it stay there. Later she would tell a friend. They don't remember the treaty dates. They barely know who surrendered, but they remember the flavor of that meat and the face of the man who handed it to them with both hands. And somehow that mattered more. Because history would teach them war. But memory would teach them kindness. The hill remained green for many years. The trail stayed packed, not from soldiers or supply trucks but from children. They still played there. They still remembered. And sometimes in the summer, when the wind was just right, they swore they could smell it again. Not just meat, but mercy.